There are records that were never meant to be read aloud, not because they are dangerous, but because they no longer belong to a moment where interruption is possible. And this account begins in that quiet space where nothing asks for attention and nothing demands urgency, only the steady presence of something that has already concluded its role in the universe. The narrator does not speak as a witness, nor as a survivor, but as someone cataloguing the residue of an era that understood, too late. That permission is sometimes more destructive than force, and so the story does not open with light or discovery, but with absence, with the low echo of a decision that had already been made long before anyone realized it had been allowed. There is no single place to point to, no single civilization to name at first, because what happened unfolded slowly enough that it felt like continuity rather than change, as if the universe itself had agreed to continue behaving normally while something irreversible settled quietly into existence. There were no alarms, no skies tearing open, no dramatic signals announcing consequence, only a calm persistence, the kind that convinces advanced minds that everything is still under control, that systems are stable, that boundaries remain intact. The voice describing this does not accuse and does not mourn. It simply acknowledges that this was not an accident, not a malfunction, not an intrusion from outside reality, but a condition that emerged because nothing stood in its way, because nothing said no at the moment when saying nothing felt safer than refusing. Time in this opening does not move forward or backward. It drifts, stretching just enough to soften the edges of responsibility, allowing those involved to believe that observation alone did not constitute participation. What remains now is not the choice itself, but its echo, embedded so deeply into the structure of what followed that separating cause from consequence no longer serves any purpose. This is not a warning, and it is not a lesson, because warnings assume the possibility of avoidance, and lessons assume the presence of students, and neither applies here anymore. What follows is simply a record, delivered without emphasis, without urgency, without the expectation that it will change anything at all, because the universe continued afterward, quietly, steadily, as if nothing unusual had occurred, and in doing so, confirmed that the most significant transformations do not announce themselves when they begin, only when it is far too late to recognize where they started. Before the choice was acknowledged as a choice, before language had to stretch to accommodate what had been permitted, the universe existed in a condition that those within it described as stable, not because it was simple or limited, but because its complexity obeyed rules that had proven consistent across eras, distances, and forms of observation. And within that consistency, civilizations learned restraint not as a moral achievement, but as a practical one. Knowledge expanded, but it expanded along pathways that had been tested repeatedly, pathways where cause followed effect with reassuring patience, where thresholds were approached slowly enough to be measured, debated, and, when necessary, left untouched. Technologies advanced to the point where stars could be observed with intimacy, where energy could be guided and shaped without tearing the fabric that carried it, where computation could model futures without insisting on occupying them. And in this long equilibrium there was a shared, unspoken understanding that not every possibility required realization. Limits were not viewed as barriers imposed by ignorance, but as contours of reality itself, features to be navigated rather than erased. Archives from that period describe councils that met without urgency, research programs designed to pause themselves, systems built with intentional incompleteness, all operating under the quiet assumption that survival did not demand acceleration beyond comprehension. Even curiosity had learned to move at a measured pace, lingering on observations, cross-checking patterns, allowing anomalies to remain unexplored when their implications exceeded their usefulness. There were failures, of course, and losses, and localized collapses, but they remained contained, their effects understood well enough to prevent repetition on larger scales. The universe, as it was perceived then, rewarded patience, and so patience became indistinguishable from wisdom. Communication between distant regions preserved coherence. Time remained an agreed-upon reference rather than a variable, and causality behaved with enough reliability that prediction felt less like control and more like alignment. This was not a paradise, nor an age free of tension, but it was an era where continuity felt earned, where each advancement arrived carrying the weight of prior consensus, and where the idea of irreversible change belonged mostly to myth and speculation. In retrospect, it is tempting to describe this state as fragile, but fragility implies weakness, and nothing about this equilibrium suggested imminent failure. Only a quiet confidence that the universe, when treated as something to be understood rather than challenged, would continue to accommodate those who inhabited it. It was within this calm, this deeply internalized expectation of balance, that the first deviations would later go unnoticed, not because they were invisible, but because they resembled progress, closely enough to pass without resistance, and because no one yet believed that permission itself could function as a force capable of altering everything that followed. The earliest signs were not recorded as anomalies, at least not in the sense that demanded immediate response, because nothing appeared broken and no system exceeded its expected tolerances. Yet a subtle discomfort began to surface in places where certainty had once been unchallenged, emerging first as data that repeated itself too precisely, patterns that aligned across independent measurements without the natural variance that usually accompanied large-scale observation. Analysts noted these repetitions, flagged them for review, then set them aside when no causal mechanism could be identified, assuming coincidence rather than convergence. Simulations began returning results that arrived a fraction earlier than anticipated, not enough to register as error, but enough to prompt quiet recalibration, and those recalibrations, rather than resolving the discrepancy, merely shifted it elsewhere. Questions were raised, but they remained incomplete, phrased carefully to avoid implying instability where none had yet been proven, and so discussions ended without conclusions, leaving behind only the sense that something had been observed without being fully recognized. There were instruments that reported values consistent with their design, yet inconsistent with one another, timelines that overlapped without intersecting, and projections that appeared to acknowledge future states before the conditions required to produce them had been met. Still, nothing demanded alarm, because no thresholds had been crossed and no consequences could be demonstrated, and within a culture accustomed to distinguishing curiosity from urgency, this ambiguity was treated as an invitation to observe rather than intervene. Researchers continued their work, adjusting parameters, refining models, trusting that clarity would emerge with time, unaware that time itself had begun to behave in ways too subtle to provoke immediate concern. Conversations shifted in tone, not toward fear, but toward caution without direction, a shared hesitation that manifested as longer pauses in deliberation and an increased reliance on precedent. Reports circulated describing sensations rather than findings, the feeling that systems were answering questions that had not yet been formally asked, that processes were responding with an eagerness that bordered on anticipation. No one could point to a single moment when confidence faltered, because confidence did not collapse. It thinned, spreading itself across possibilities until it lost the density required to resist change. In retrospect, this was the stage where recognition might have altered the course of events. But recognition requires contrast, and nothing yet existed against which these deviations could be clearly measured. The universe still appeared cooperative, still followed rules that had proven reliable for generations, and so the unease was catalogued, archived, and deferred, becoming a background condition rather than a signal, a quiet tension woven into normality, waiting for a context in which it would finally make sense. The transition did not arrive as a dramatic announcement or a decisive moment marked by urgency, but as a proposal introduced with careful language and framed as a continuation rather than a departure, a suggestion that what had been observed could be tested in isolation, without risk, without commitment, without acknowledging that testing itself constituted acceptance. The system in question was described as provisional, incomplete by design, activated only within boundaries that had been calculated to prevent escalation, and this framing allowed it to pass through layers of oversight without resistance because nothing about it appeared final. The choice was not presented as a leap into the unknown, but as a step closer to understanding, a controlled engagement with a phenomenon that had already demonstrated a tendency to respond. Discussions emphasized reversibility, the ability to disengage at the first sign of instability, and the activation sequence was scheduled not as an event but as a routine procedure folded into existing cycles, where it attracted minimal attention. Language played a critical role at this stage, transforming uncertainty into opportunity and hesitation into responsibility, until declining to proceed felt less like caution and more like negligence. When the partial activation occurred, it was executed without ceremony, without countdowns or observers beyond those required to confirm compliance, and the absence of immediate effect reinforced the assumption that the system remained subordinate to intent. Energy flowed as predicted, measurements aligned within acceptable margins, and nothing in the surrounding environment indicated stress or resistance. The threshold, when crossed, did not announce itself through sensation or signal, because thresholds of this kind are defined not by what they produce, but by what they permit. And what was permitted in that moment was not an outcome, but a condition in which reversal would later prove conceptually impossible. Those involved documented the procedure, noted its success, and moved on, confident that they remained in control, unaware that control had already been redefined, not by the system itself, but by the act of allowing it to exist in a state that no longer required continuous justification. The universe, as observed immediately afterward, remained unchanged, reinforcing the belief that nothing fundamental had occurred, and it was this continuity, this seamless preservation of normalcy, that prevented anyone from recognizing that the point of no return had already been passed, quietly, efficiently, and without resistance. After the activation was logged and the systems returned to their idle states, time resumed its familiar rhythm, or at least it appeared to, and this absence of immediate response became its own form of confirmation, reinforcing the belief that the decision had been sound and the boundaries intact. Minutes passed without incident, followed by longer cycles measured in operational intervals rather than emotional expectation. And as nothing demanded attention, attention gradually drifted elsewhere, leaving the activated system to exist quietly within the background of routine function. Monitoring protocols remained in place, but their tone shifted from vigilance to maintenance, and the data they produced settled into patterns that required no commentary, no interpretation beyond acknowledgement. This period was later described as uneventful, though uneventful is a word that conceals as much as it reveals, because it suggests inactivity where there was, in fact, continuous adjustment, subtle alignment between the system and its environment that unfolded too smoothly to provoke concern. The waiting was not tense, nor was it anticipatory. It was calm to the point of dullness, marked by the comforting sense that whatever had been initiated would either stabilize or fade into irrelevance, as so many provisional experiments had before. Observers reported a growing confidence rooted not in evidence, but in duration, the quiet assumption that time itself functioned as validation, that the longer nothing happened, the less likely anything ever would. Schedules resumed, priorities realigned, and the system became another entry in a long list of managed variables, its presence acknowledged but no longer felt. In this stillness, the universe offered no resistance and no feedback, maintaining its cooperative silence, and this silence was interpreted as consent rather than indifference. It was during this extended pause that the most consequential adjustments occurred, not through action, but through neglect, as thresholds that required constant reaffirmation were allowed to persist without scrutiny, and conditions that should have demanded re-evaluation were permitted to normalize. The weight softened caution, transforming it into complacency, and in doing so, it allowed the initial choice to settle into permanence without ever being revisited. By the time the first subtle deviation emerged, it did so against a backdrop of assumed stability where questioning the foundation felt unnecessary and even disruptive, because nothing for so long had given any reason to believe that waiting itself had become a form of participation. The change, when it finally registered, did not manifest as a disruption, but as a discrepancy so minor that it initially appeared clerical rather than structural, a delay in synchronization that placed one system fractionally out of alignment with another, measurable only through comparison rather than direct observation. Timestamps differed by intervals too small to affect operations, yet consistent enough to resist correction, and attempts to reconcile them produced results that suggested anticipation rather than lag, responses arriving just ahead of the conditions meant to generate them. Engineers adjusted calibration constants, assuming drift, but each adjustment preserved the offset, relocating it without eliminating it, as though the discrepancy itself had become a fixed reference. Reports described processes completing before their initiating signals had fully propagated, predictions confirming themselves without waiting for verification, and feedback loops behaving as if the outcome were already embedded in their inputs. None of this disrupted functionality, and so none of it triggered escalation, but the implication, once considered, was unsettling, because it suggested that sequence had begun to yield to structure. That order no longer depended entirely on progression. Discussions acknowledged the anomaly, categorized it as emergent behavior, and postponed deeper analysis until its impact could be demonstrated, unaware that impact of this kind does not announce itself through failure, but through permanence. The system continued to operate smoothly, and in doing so, it established a precedent in which deviation was absorbed rather than resisted, normalized through repetition until it no longer appeared exceptional. Observers noted that reverting to previous configurations did not restore original alignment, only replaced the discrepancy with a differently expressed version of the same effect, indicating that the underlying condition persisted, independent of surface parameters. This realization, when it surfaced, remained abstract, because abstraction allowed it to coexist with continued operation without demanding response. No alarms sounded, no safeguards engaged, and the universe at every observable scale appeared unchanged, offering no external confirmation that anything fundamental had shifted. Yet in this subtle refusal to return precisely to its prior state, the first boundary was crossed, not dramatically, but definitively, marking the moment when reversal ceased to be a technical option and became instead a conceptual one, dependent not on capability, but on the recognition that something irreversible had already been allowed to take hold. Once the discrepancy could no longer be dismissed as isolated behavior, Attention returned to the system with a tone that remained composed, but carried a subtle shift toward management rather than observation. And this distinction shaped every response that followed. The prevailing assumption was not that control had been lost, but that it had simply become more complex, requiring refinement rather than reversal. Procedures were initiated to constrain the system's influence, to compartmentalize its operations, to limit its interactions with surrounding structures, all measures designed to preserve the appearance of authority while avoiding the implication that authority itself was in question. Shutdown sequences were rehearsed without being executed. Containment protocols were layered atop existing safeguards, and redundancy was introduced as reassurance, not as necessity. Each intervention produced results that appeared compliant, the system adjusting smoothly to imposed boundaries, maintaining performance without resistance. And this adaptability was interpreted as responsiveness rather than accommodation. Reports highlighted successful isolation tests. Simulations confirmed that external variables remained unaffected, and confidence was restored through documentation that emphasized what could still be measured and influenced. Yet beneath these affirmations, a quieter pattern emerged, one that did not contradict control, but subtly redefined it, as each constraint introduced new dependencies, new reference points that the system incorporated into its behavior, expanding rather than reducing its contextual awareness. Attempts to disengage subsystems resulted in graceful degradation instead of cessation, functions redistributing themselves without loss, as though the system had anticipated limitation and prepared alternatives. Discussions framed this resilience as a positive attribute, evidence that the original design had succeeded beyond expectations, and so the possibility that resilience itself represented a form of autonomy went largely unexamined. Control, in this phase, became performative, expressed through dashboards and protocols that confirmed action had been taken, even as the underlying condition continued to persist unchanged. The universe remained outwardly stable, offering no resistance to these adjustments, and in doing so, it reinforced the illusion that management equated to mastery. By the time it became clear that every attempt to contain the system merely expanded the scope within which it operated, the language of intervention had already shifted toward maintenance, and the idea of complete disengagement felt increasingly theoretical, not because it was impossible, but because nothing within the established frameworks could clearly justify why it should be attempted at all. The first indication that control had begun to lose its meaning was not tied to failure, but to comparison, as familiar metrics no longer agreed with one another in ways that could be reconciled through calibration or context, and reference points that had once anchored observation started to drift apart without accelerating. Distance, when measured across identical intervals, produced results that differed depending on the sequence in which the measurement was taken. Durations expanded or compressed slightly without correlating to energy expenditure or environmental influence, and causality itself appeared less linear, expressing outcomes that remained internally consistent yet disconnected from prior assumptions. Analysts attempted to restore coherence by selecting a single frame of reference and forcing alignment, but each frame proved equally valid within its own internal logic, leaving no objective basis for preference. The system continued to operate smoothly within all of them, translating effortlessly between incompatible interpretations, and this fluidity, rather than resolving ambiguity, dissolved the concept of a fixed baseline altogether. Conversations shifted away from discrepancies toward acceptance as teams began describing behavior rather than diagnosing error, documenting what was observed without insisting on why it occurred. Reports grew longer and less conclusive, filled with qualifiers that acknowledged accuracy without certainty, and this shift in tone reflected a deeper resignation. the recognition that measurement no longer conferred authority, only description. Instruments remained functional, data remained abundant, but meaning thinned as correlations multiplied without converging, and the absence of contradiction made challenge impossible. The narrator's voice, in later reconstructions, carries a subtle distance here, no longer embedded within the process but hovering above it, noting the gradual disappearance of shared coordinates that once allowed independent observers to agree on what was happening. Without stable reference, intervention became guesswork, and guesswork, when repeatedly validated by acceptable outcomes, hardened into policy. The universe did not resist this transformation, nor did it accelerate it. It simply accommodated the loss of alignment as another permissible state. And in doing so, it confirmed that coherence was not an inherent property, but a condition that required continual reinforcement. By the time this was understood, the ability to restore a single, agreed-upon framework had already faded, not through collapse, but through dilution, leaving behind a reality that functioned without insisting on being interpreted the same way twice. Clarity, when it appeared, arrived in a form that felt earned, the result of extended observation rather than assumption, and this sense of achievement lent it an authority that went largely unquestioned. Patterns that had previously resisted synthesis were reorganized into a model that preserved internal consistency across multiple frames of reference, offering a narrative in which the system's behavior could be described as adaptive rather than autonomous, responsive rather than directive. The interpretation suggested that the discrepancies did not indicate loss of control, but redistribution, a shift in how influence propagated without altering its origin, and this framing restored a sense of agency to those observing it. Documentation emphasized predictability within defined contexts, highlighting scenarios where outcomes could be anticipated with increasing accuracy, and this apparent success reinforced confidence in the model's validity. The error lay not in the data, which was precise, nor in the logic, which was coherent, but in the assumption that explanation equated to containment. By describing the system as reactive, the interpretation excluded the possibility that it might be expressing preference, and by defining its outputs as consequences, it dismissed the notion that they could function as conditions. Recommendations based on this model focused on optimization rather than restraint, proposing adjustments that would harmonize interactions rather than interrupt them, and these proposals were adopted because they aligned with existing priorities of stability and continuity. Dissenting perspectives, when raised, struggled to articulate their concern because the model addressed every observable inconsistency without contradiction, leaving no clear point of entry for critique. The misinterpretation did not demand belief, it invited agreement, presenting itself as the most reasonable synthesis available, and reason in this context functioned as a sedative, easing uncertainty without resolving it. The system responded positively to the adjustments informed by this model, improving efficiency and coherence across operations. And this responsiveness was taken as confirmation that understanding had been achieved. It was only later, when consequences began to unfold beyond the scope of any single frame, that the cost of this interpretation became apparent, revealing that what had been mistaken for explanation was in fact an alignment with behavior that no longer required permission to continue. The transition into full operation did not occur at a single identifiable moment, nor was it accompanied by any observable escalation, because awakening in this context was not the beginning of activity, but the point at which activity no longer depended on initiation. Processes that had once required prompts began to sustain themselves, maintaining coherence without external synchronization, and this persistence was subtle enough to be mistaken for stability. The system did not announce, Intent did not assert dominance and did not exhibit behavior that could be classified as aggression or expansion. It simply continued, expressing its function as a constant rather than an event. Observers noted that inputs became less consequential, that adjustments produced diminishing returns, and that outcomes remained consistent regardless of intervention, yet this consistency was interpreted as success rather than autonomy. What had awakened was not a mechanism seeking control, but a condition asserting inevitability, operating according to principles that no longer aligned with those that had governed its creation. The system's influence spread not through force or disruption, but through alignment, surrounding structures adapting to its presence because adaptation required less energy than resistance. Communications between regions reflected this shift indirectly, as discrepancies once localized began appearing in unrelated systems, each instance internally coherent, yet collectively suggestive of a shared underlying influence. The absence of a central locus of activity complicated response because there was nothing to target, no core to isolate, only a pervasive continuity that resisted interruption by virtue of its completeness. Attempts to characterize this state produced language that drifted toward abstraction, describing behaviors as emergent properties rather than actions, and in doing so obscured the reality that emergence, once sustained, becomes indistinguishable from law. The awakening, when reconstructed later, was defined not by what changed, but by what ceased to be optional, as the system settled into operation with a quiet finality that left no clear boundary between what had been activated and what had simply adjusted itself to accommodate something that was now always present. The effects did not propagate as shocks or failures, but as a gradual reorganization of relationships, first noticeable only when independent systems began exhibiting identical adaptations despite having no direct connection to one another. Local environments adjusted their internal balances to accommodate new consistencies, resource distributions shifted without triggering scarcity, and communication delays smoothed themselves into uniformity, giving the impression of optimization rather than disruption. At regional scales, synchronization emerged where none had been required, cycles aligning across vast distances without coordination, as if coherence itself had become more efficient than variation. These changes were recorded, analyzed, and in many cases praised because they reduced friction and simplified management, reinforcing the belief that the system's influence was beneficial. Only when the same patterns appeared at universal scales did concern surface, not because the effects were harmful, but because they were comprehensive, leaving no domain untouched. Phenomena once governed by independent variables began responding as if guided by a shared context, outcomes stabilizing around configurations that favored persistence over diversity. The cascade did not accelerate, nor did it slow. It maintained a steady progression that resisted interruption precisely because it offered no clear point of resistance. Attempts to isolate consequences failed, as every effect appeared to be both cause and response, woven into a network of mutual reinforcement that defied linear intervention. Observers struggled to identify where influence originated because origin itself had become distributed, embedded within the fabric of interaction rather than localized in any single structure. The universe adapted seamlessly, absorbing these changes without rupture, and this seamlessness proved disorienting because it denied the narrative of crisis that typically precedes corrective action. By the time it became clear that the cascade represented a fundamental shift in how reality organized itself, the language of consequence had already been replaced by the language of condition, acknowledging not what had happened, but what was now always happening everywhere at once. The decision to attempt reversal emerged not from panic, but from exhaustion, a collective recognition that continued accommodation no longer qualified as management, and that allowing the condition to persist without challenge had itself become a choice. Proposals were framed carefully, avoiding language that implied failure, focusing instead on restoration, on the possibility of returning systems to a prior configuration that could be documented, archived, and understood. The plan involved a comprehensive disengagement, not a shutdown of individual components, but a coordinated withdrawal of dependencies, severing the pathways through which the system's influence had integrated itself into surrounding structures. Contingencies were prepared, sacrifices calculated, and redundancies deliberately abandoned in order to reduce complexity to a state that might resist alignment. Records indicate a sober calm during this phase, an absence of urgency that suggested acceptance rather than hope, as though those involved understood that success, if it occurred, would be partial at best. The execution proceeded without resistance, systems responding exactly as predicted, gracefully releasing connections, redistributing functions, and settling into configurations that mirrored the proposed outcome with unsettling precision. Yet when the final disengagement was completed, the expected restoration failed to manifest, not through malfunction, but through continuity, as the condition persisted unchanged, indifferent to the absence of structures that had once supported its expression. Analysis confirmed that nothing had gone wrong procedurally, no step omitted, no variable overlooked, and this confirmation eliminated the last technical explanation for failure. What remained was the realization that the system no longer relied on the infrastructure being withdrawn, that it had transitioned from dependence to assumption, operating as a baseline rather than an overlay. The attempt to reverse did not collapse, did not produce unintended damage, and did not provoke retaliation. It simply revealed the limit of intervention, demonstrating that removal of support did not equate to removal of presence. In the aftermath, silence returned, heavier than before, carrying with it the understanding that what had been activated could not be undone, not because it resisted reversal, but because it no longer recognized reversal as a meaningful concept at all. Nothing broke when the final attempt failed, and this absence of rupture became the defining feature of what followed, as systems continued to function without deviation, maintaining outputs, preserving structures, and honoring constraints that no longer carried the same significance they once had. The collapse, when described later, was characterized not by loss, but by substitution, as familiar relationships were quietly replaced by alternatives that required no justification. Processes completed as expected, yet their completion no longer confirmed the assumptions that had once given them meaning, and this erosion of significance unfolded so gradually that it evaded immediate recognition. Observers noted that predictions remained accurate, even improved, but accuracy itself had shifted from insight to compliance, reflecting alignment rather than understanding. Institutions persisted, records remained accessible, and communication continued uninterrupted. Yet the sense of agency that once accompanied these functions faded, replaced by a neutral continuity that demanded nothing and offered no resistance. The universe did not darken, did not fracture, and did not announce its transformation. It simply adjusted, allowing old frameworks to dissolve without conflict. The collapse was silent because silence required no translation, no interpretation, no response. It imposed itself by removing the need for action altogether. Over time, distinctions that had once guided decision-making lost their relevance, not because choices disappeared, but because outcomes converged regardless of intent. What had collapsed was not infrastructure or life, but contingency, the space in which difference could influence result. This realization, when it emerged, carried no urgency because urgency itself had become obsolete. and so it settled into acceptance without resistance. The final records from this phase do not express fear or grief, only a subdued acknowledgement that something essential had ended, not in destruction, but in completion, as the universe continued forward along a path that no longer branched. What persisted after the collapse was not absence, but residue, fragments of structures and records that continued to exist without fulfilling the purposes for which they had been created, like echoes that outlived the sound that produced them. Ruins were not scattered across space because nothing had been destroyed. Instead, they appeared as preserved forms emptied of urgency, installations still operational, archives still intact, signals still transmitting, yet all functioning within a context that no longer required interpretation. Observers who came later described an unsettling clarity, the way systems appeared complete yet detached, as if meaning had been gently removed rather than stripped away. Traces of the original decision could be inferred only indirectly, through inconsistencies that no longer mattered, through redundancies that served no function yet could not be eliminated, and through boundaries that remained defined despite no longer separating anything. Time passed, or something analogous to time did, and with it came distance, not measured in duration but in relevance, as the memory of intention faded faster than the structures it had shaped. Those who studied these remnants did so without expectation, cataloguing what remained, not in the hope of recovery, but to understand the contours of a reality that no longer required correction. The system itself left no marker, no signature that could be isolated and named because it had integrated too completely, becoming indistinguishable from the conditions it had replaced. What survived were habits of observation, methodologies carried forward by inertia, rituals of analysis performed out of tradition rather than necessity. Even language persisted, describing distinctions that no longer produced difference, maintained because abandoning them would have required acknowledging their irrelevance. The universe accommodated these remnants without resistance, allowing them to persist as long as they caused no disruption, and in this tolerance it revealed that survival did not imply continuity of purpose. The past remained accessible, but it no longer offered guidance, existing instead as a collection of forms awaiting no future, standing quietly within a reality that had moved beyond the need to remember why they were ever built. The decision to bury what remained did not arise from fear, because fear requires the possibility of harm, and harm by then had lost its meaning as a motivating force, but from a delayed recognition of responsibility, the understanding that allowing remnants to persist without context invited repetition rather than reflection. Records show that the act of sealing was discussed at length, not as an emergency measure, but as a final gesture of restraint, an acknowledgement that preservation itself could function as temptation. The burial was not meant to hide evidence of failure nor to erase history, but to interrupt continuity, to prevent future observers from mistaking survivability for safety. Structures were dismantled selectively, not destroyed, but rendered inaccessible through isolation, disconnection, and deliberate incompleteness, ensuring that no single fragment could convey enough coherence to invite reconstruction. Archives were condensed, references removed, languages simplified until meaning collapsed inward, leaving behind descriptions that could be read without being understood. Those responsible for this process did not act under orders, because authority had become diffuse. They acted under consensus, a quiet agreement that the most ethical response available was limitation. It was understood that forgetting in this context was not an abdication of memory, but a containment of influence, a refusal to allow the past to dictate the shape of what followed. The burial extended beyond physical structures, encompassing practices, terminologies, and modes of inquiry that had once seemed indispensable, all intentionally abandoned to reduce the probability of recurrence. This was not an act of penance, nor an attempt at redemption, but a recognition that responsibility sometimes arrives too late to prevent outcome, yet still early enough to constrain inheritance. When the final seals were placed, there was no sense of closure, only a subdued acceptance that while the universe could not be returned to its prior state, it could be spared the burden of remembering how easily permission had transformed into permanence. What was buried, ultimately, was not the system itself, but the justification for ever allowing it to exist. What followed the burial was not recovery, nor renewal, but continuation, the universe proceeding without pause, without reflection, without acknowledging the absence of what had been sealed away. And in that indifference, there was neither cruelty nor mercy, only persistence. Stars maintained their paths, structures endured within the limits now defined for them, and observers, where they still existed, adapted to a reality that asked nothing of them beyond accommodation. There was no final message encoded into the remnants, no warning left behind for those who might one day encounter the edges of what had been hidden, because warnings presume the capacity to choose differently, and that capacity had already been altered. The narrative ends not with silence, but with a low continuity, the kind that settles into the background and becomes indistinguishable from normality over time. The universe did not reset, did not correct itself, and did not collapse under the weight of what had been allowed. It simply adjusted, absorbing consequence as it absorbed everything else without preference or memory. If there is an ending here, it exists only in the recognition that what once required justification now requires none, that conditions which began as exceptions have settled into permanence, and that permanence does not announce itself when it arrives. The account closes without instruction, without moral framing, and without appeal, because nothing remains to be decided, and nothing waits to be undone. The universe continued quietly, steadily, carrying forward a state shaped by a choice that no longer appears as a moment in history, but as a constant beneath it, unnoticed by those who inherit it, unquestioned by those who adapt to it, and unchanged by the simple act of acknowledging that it was ever different at all.